Now when Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, there came wise men from the east to Jerusalem, saying, Where is he this born King of the Jews? For we've seen his star in the east, and we're come to worship him. When Herod the king had heard these things, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. When he had gathered all the chief priests and scribes of the people together, he demanded of them where Christ should be born. They said unto him, In Bethlehem of Judea, for thus it is written by the prophet, And thou, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, art not the least among the princes of Judah, for out of thee shall come a governor, that shall rule my people Israel. Then Herod, when he had privately called wise men, inquired of them diligently what time the star had appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem, and said, Go, search diligently for the young child. When you have found him, bring me word again, that I may come and worship him also. When they had heard the king, they departed. And lo, the star that they saw in the east went before them, till it came and stood over where the young child was. And when they saw the star, they rejoiced with exceeding great joy. When they were come into the house, they saw the young child with Mary his mother, and fell down and worshipped him. When they had opened their treasures, they presented unto him gifts, gold, and frankincense, and myrrh. Shall we again pause for a word of prayer? Father, we ask that you would open up your word and speak to our hearts this day. Lord, we're here because we need a word from you. We realize there is no word unless it's a word from you, and there's no message except it come from you. So, Father, we pray that you would speak to our hearts, that you would bring us your word, that your people might rejoice and be glad in you. In Jesus' name, amen. 3 weeks ago, we looked at Santa Claus and its application in relevance to Christmas. 2 weeks ago, we looked at the Christmas tree and its history and how that could apply to Christmas. Last week, we had a missionary speaker who was here and shared with us the mission field needs, while me and a couple of my kids and 3 of my grandkids had an appointment with Mickey Mouse down in Orlando. It is so good to be back. Let me tell you, I have had enough of Orlando. We're so glad to get back home. I'm not sure we'll ever go anywhere ever again. But we've got our going out, and it's great to be back. Well, today, I want us to think for a little while about Christmas lights. Let's look at Christmas lights, and then let's make our application to them. Christmas lights, as we know them, have really been around less than 100 years. First documented reference to anything very closely related or in any way partially related to a Christmas tree would be in 1184 in Germany. There, people began to burn what is called a Yule log. December is the darkest day of the year, or month of the year, and the shortest days of the year. And so they began to burn what they call a Yule log, because fire from a great big hunk of wood would provide light, and it would provide warmth. And it also in that day had a symbolic significance that the sun would come back and would shine again. Christians had Christmas trees, and then they had Christmas lights. Somehow they got the idea of trying to put them together in the 17th century. That idea first occurred, and it took a while before that idea caught on. In 1832, a Harvard professor named Charles Follen decorated an evergreen tree with candles. And that's believed to be the first use of Christmas lights at Christmas time on a public display. The first Christmas trees were sold in New York City, in Washington Market, around 1851. Some entrepreneur got the idea that he'd cut down some trees and bring them to New York City and sell them. And you know, people were crazy enough that they bought them. And that was the first example of trees being sold. In 1856, the first public display of Christmas trees on the White House lawn was erected by President Franklin Pierce. Then things began to grow and then to continue to own. Back then, the only way that you have lights on a Christmas tree was by a candle. And so they attached candles to a Christmas tree by wax or by a pin. The only problem was they caught the Christmas trees on fire. And so they learned that they had to get very fresh Christmas trees, and they could only use them a few days before the needles would dry out on them. And then they discovered that the only way they could have any lights on a Christmas tree was to burn them for just a few minutes every night, for a very few nights. Then they would stand and they'd watch them very carefully, and they would have beside them a bucket of sand and a bucket of water. So if the Christmas tree caught on fire, they'd have something to put it out with and dispose of it. They went to an awful lot of trouble to have a few minutes of a lighted Christmas tree back then. So they had trouble with that, and they thought that it was worth the effort and the trouble. Can you imagine today what we would have to do if we were back in that age, if we had the Christmas trees like we have? I think most of them say that's more trouble than it's worth. But they wanted to see a lighted Christmas tree so much, they did that. Well, Thomas Edison invented the electric lights. And in 1880, he had a brainstorm of an idea. He put his electric lights all around his lab at Christmas time, but it really wasn't so much to celebrate Christmas as it was to advertise his lights and get people to look at the lights. And that was the first actual demonstration of electric lights that we'd ever seen. And then 2 years later, a young man named Edward Johnson, who worked for Thomas Edison, came up with the idea of putting lights on a Christmas tree. And he put up a string of 80 lights on a tree that he had found, and it was the most spectacular thing they'd ever seen then. The only problem was, he had concentrated so much on the lights that the tree he found would have made Charlie Brown's Christmas tree look spectacular. He didn't pay much attention to the tree, and he had the most struggling looking tree there, and he put a string of 80 lights on it. But boy, that looked spectacular. It's something they had never seen before. Well, in 1900, a single string of electric lights cost $12. Doesn't sound like much today, but in today's money, that's over $300 for a small string of lights that would cost back then. Well, advertising for Christmas trees came out in the first that we know of in Scientific American magazine, also in 1900. But the Christmas lights they advertised were so expensive, they suggested renting the lights for one day at Christmas time. So they were so expensive, they knew nobody would buy them, so they suggested they rented them out. From that was the very beginning. But in 1908, insurance companies all across America said, we will not pay for any damage caused by Christmas trees, because the common man still was trying to use candles, and they were still setting Christmas trees on fire and burning their house down. So in 1908, insurance says, we will no longer pay any damage for any fire that's caused by a Christmas tree. By 1914, because of the mass production, things began to grow, and Christmas tree lights got a little bit less expensive, and a string of Christmas lights was sold for $1.74. Doesn't sound like much to us today, $1.74 for a string of Christmas lights, but in our equivalent money, that's about $50 they would pay for a string of Christmas lights back then. But by 1920, with further ingenuity, further mass production, prices became affordable for the common man. So in 1920, for the first time, Christmas lights were within the reach of the average person. 1917, a 15-year-old boy named Albert Sadaka got the idea to put a protected Christmas light. His family sold Christmas ornaments and decorations, and he took some of those ornaments and some of those decorations, and he made a protected light that wouldn't set the tree on fire. And he sold a grand total of 100 strings of light that first year. The next year, he got another inspiration. He got colored light bulbs put on it, and they took off, and that was the beginning of $1 million business. And his company, Noma Electric, became the largest seller of Christmas tree lights in the world. And they, for many years, up until they quit making lights in 1969, were the leading production of Christmas tree lights. Well, in 1940, there was the invention of the bubble lights. And in the 1940s, Americans could buy lights that twinkle, and lights that flicker, and lights that blinked. Today, there are more than 150 million strings of Christmas tree lights sold annually. And more than 80 million homes are lighted up by Christmas tree today. This is an American invention, American way of life. America is really the only place you see a lot of Christmas lights. It's not done much anywhere else in the world. Indeed, the American creation of Christmas lights has really taken off. And the American invention has become spectacular displays. Well, I remember the spectacular displays we saw at Disney World. And all around us we see spectacular displays of electric lights. Do you know what? The most spectacular display of Christmas lights isn't what we see today, as spectacular they are. And it's not the electric lights that was invented by Thomas Edison. The most spectacular display of Christmas lights was that which God the Father did as a proud father to announce the birth of his Son. The most spectacular display of Christmas lights was just out of this world. The most spectacular display of Christmas lights that we've ever seen was higher than the highest, brighter than the brightest, bigger than the biggest. It was called the Star of Bethlehem. Can you imagine that first great display of Christmas lights was when that gigantic star appeared? Nobody had seen anything like it before or since. Nobody knew what it was. But that great Star of Bethlehem came, and it illuminated the sky. Everybody saw that huge light that was there. But everybody did not understand what it was all about. Everybody saw it, but few responded to it. Few recognized the value that it had, and few recognized what it was. The announcement of the birth of the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. Fewer still followed that light to lead to where the Christ child was. And indeed, those few who did follow lost their sense of direction and their sense of dedication. And they took their eyes off that light that was leading them where the Christ child was, and they ended up in the palace of Herod. They started out following the light, but they ended up in a king who lived in darkness. When they left Herod, they went out and they simply looked up, and that star was still there. The star had been there all the time. The light that had been their guide was there all the time. But as they got close to Jerusalem, they seemed to say, we followed you for a long, long way. Now we can take over from here. We know that a king had to be born in a palace. And so they forsook following the light that they had been following from so far. They used their own judgment. They ended up of all places in the palace of the most evil king of their day. You know, after they left Herod, they looked up, and that star was still there. It had been there all the time. They had just failed to follow it. When they saw the star, they rejoiced with exceeding great joy. They had lost their way, but the star was there all the time to lead them to their journey's end. When they rediscovered the star, they didn't lose sight of it again. The tragic thing for me, maybe for many of you, we've lost sight of the star and we've discovered it only to lose sight of it again. I wonder how many times we've lost sight of that star in our life. And we somehow have let other things take its place. And we looked all around us and we didn't see the star. We didn't see the leadership. We didn't see the guidance. We didn't see the sense of direction. As long as those wise men were in Herod's palace, they didn't see the star. But you know, it came about because they stopped looking up and they started looking around and they started looking down. And today when we stop looking up and we start looking down at our circumstances and our situation and how bad everything is, when we start looking up and when we stop looking up and start magnifying how difficult our circumstances are and the trouble we're in and the difficulties we're in, we cannot see that star either. But you know, it's only when we look up above our difficulties, above our struggles, above our failures, we see the star still there. All God asks is that we stop looking at how big our problems are and start looking at how big He is. When we simply look up, He's still there. And He's been there all the time. When they looked up and saw the star, they followed it all the way to where the Christ child was. That bright star that had illuminated the whole world, they had seen from afar off. Now they saw that it led them to a very personal application and a very personal place. They followed the star and it led them to the Christ child. They found Him. When they found the Christ child, they found that He was worthy of their praise. The greatest gift ever given had been given to them. They responded by giving of their gifts, gold and frankincense and myrrh. Well, I just told you a little story of Christmas lights. The story of the star. I asked you one question. Have you seen the light? You see that star of Bethlehem? That light of Jesus, it's still shining. It's still there. In a war-weary world, in a world of trouble and confusion, in a world where we don't know where to go, in a world where we don't know where to come, in a world where we're on the edge of what they call a fiscal cliff, in a world where it seems that God has been pushed out of all of our lives, He's still there. You still see the light. You still see the fact that it doesn't really matter who we are. What matters is who He is. Doesn't really matter what we can do. What it matters is what He can do, and He can do through us. Doesn't really matter who we are. What matters is who He is. And when we accept the power of who He is, He can come in and make a glorious difference in who we are. When we realize we can do nothing, but He can do all things, then His light and His power can take people who failed, people who've fallen down, people who so many times have lost sight of the light. He can use His light through us, and that light can shine. That's why we're here as a lighthouse on the beach, the Orange Beach, and the people who come from around the world. One time or another, everybody comes to Orange Beach. What an opportunity we have to be a light, to be a witness. Most of my life, I was a traveling evangelist. After my third heart attack, I quit going on the road, foreign countries, and we just bought a condo here to retire. But you know, that church that wasn't there kept dropping, kept being in my mind, in my imagination. When I drive up and down this beach highway, I could see that church that wasn't there, and now that church is here. Say, I've still got a light. I can still use you. You don't have to travel all the world anymore. At one time, it was my call to go into all the world. Hey, now I can just stay right here, and all the world comes here. I'm still a full-time evangelist. I never quit being. It's just that now, it's different. I don't have to go into all the world. I just stay here, and all the world comes here. Look in our small group today. How many different states are represented? Every Sunday, we've got people from all over the world. We've had people, I believe, from just about every state. Several people from Alaska, even beautiful as Alaska is, they come down here to see the beauty of our Gulf Coast. We've had people from many, many foreign countries. You know, here we've had people from China and from Russia, Czechoslovakia, and all of South America. So many, many people. They're coming here. And it's our chance to let that light shine. It's our chance to tell them that that Star of Bethlehem is still shining. So I ask you, have you seen the light? Then I ask you a second question. Have you lost sight of the light? Maybe there's a time in your life when, yes, you did see the light. The light of Jesus did live in your heart. The light of Jesus was your guide, and you had a reason for living, and you had a joy, and every day with Jesus was sweeter than the day before. Somehow you've lost that joy. You've lost that sense of direction. You've lost that peace. And you're filled with turmoil and you're filled with confusion. That's what happens when we take our eyes off the light. That's what happens when we take our eyes off Jesus. So I want to ask you, have you lost sight of the light? What's motivating you? What are you living for? What gives you joy? What gives you peace? What gives you power? Have you lost sight of the light? You know that one time you had that light. But like those wise men in the temple of Herod, they lost it. They ended up in the very worst place they could go in seeking the light of the world. Have you ended up in some terrible places because you lost sight of the light? Have you ended up in some terrible circumstances because you lost sight of the light? Hey, look up. The light's still there. All the wise men had to do was look up. They lost sight of the light, not because the light went away, because they took their eyes off the light. They used their own imagination as to where they thought they ought to go, rather than following where the light leads. Could it be that you're here today, and you've lost sight of the light, and you're wandering around, and you don't know where to go, and you don't know what to do? You've got, instead of a joy, a misery. I've got one word. Simply stop looking down. Stop looking at how bad things are. Stop looking at your circumstances and simply look up. And you'll find that light still there. And I've got one final question. Are you following the light? The wise men followed that star. They followed the light for a long way. They lost sight of it. When they looked up again and saw it, they rejoiced with exceeding great joy. That's what happens. There is no joy like the joy of a child of God coming home. There's no joy like the joy that comes when one who's been filled with strife and guilt and stress simply looks up and lets the light of God flood his heart and his life. There is no joy like that joy that comes when we simply look up and we see the star. And so I ask you, are you following the light? Well, the light's still there. That light, though this world tries to cover it up, though this world tries to say, you can't see the light, you can't have the light in public places, you can't have the light in schools, you can't have the light in any public property, the light is still there. And all we have to do is look up. So the final question is, are you following the light? What is the direction of your life? What are you living for? What is your purpose of life? You seem like you become just a robot going around in circles without any purpose. Listen, God has a glorious, wonderful purpose for your life. You are not here by accident today, and you are not in this life by accident. God has a glorious, wonderful purpose for your life that's greater than anything you can ever imagine. And it's more glorious than anything that you can ever create. And happiness, joy, peace comes from discovering that purpose that God has for your life and following His light to fulfill that purpose. So I ask you, are you here today at this Christmas season? You've seen an awful lot of lights, but are you following the light? The light of the world. And that light of the world is Jesus. He said, if you follow me, you'll not walk in darkness, for I am the light of the life. The light of the world, the light of your life, the light of your hope, the light of your peace, the light of your very existence is Jesus Christ. Are you following Him? Have you come to know Him? Have you accepted Him? Are you day by day so in step with Him that He guides and He leads and He directs your path? That's what it's all about, folks. That's what Christmas is all about. Christmas is not about Santa Claus. Christmas is not about Christmas trees. Christmas is not about spectacular lights. Christmas is about Jesus Christ, the greatest gift that was ever given. For God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in Him would not perish, but would have